Today, we become legends.
The majority of my playtime in Smite 2 has been in ranked conquest, but recently I've been playing a little more casual conquest and some other casual modes, and it's really brought my attention to the tank meta claims that have been flying around lately in the community. I'll be completely honest here and say that in my ranked games, I really didn't see what all the fuss was about. Are there times when a tank seems unkillable and hard carries the game? Sure, but in my experience there were an equal or even larger number of times that a damage dealer or bruiser has run away with the game in a similar way. Oh, and I'm talking about before OB7 and OB8 here, which for the most part were overall nerfs to tanks in their item pool, with things like Mystical Mail, Glad Shield, Pribwin, and Runeforged all receiving additional nerfs on top of the OB7 stat squish, and OB8 hitting almost every protection item in the game down on top of already getting their protections lowered in line with the rest of OB7. Some items that had 40 protections a few patches ago now have 20, a 50% decrease compared to every other stat in the game that only received a 12 to 15% decrease from OB7. Granted, some of these items had their power shifted into their passives like Pribwin, Glad Shield, and Berserker Shield, but it's sort of hard to justify an item scaling off of your protections when half your items give only 20 to 30 protections in the first place. And even in a full tank build nowadays, you barely reach 200 protections, and that's including god-based stats. But I started out the video talking about my experience in casuals for a reason. My ranked games, even before these changes, were rarely completely run by a tank, and only sometimes completely run by a bruiser. And I do feel like most of those times it was the god being the outlier and not the general meta, you know, stuff like Sobek. These are Masters ranked games I'm talking about, by the way, for anyone curious at what level I play at. However, when I started playing some casuals and non-conquest modes, I started to realize a bit more what everyone is complaining about and why there's so much noise around this in the community. The majority of the player base are not playing ranked conquest, so this is their experience, and man is it very different from high-end ranked games. In my casuals, tanks were running lobbies and did feel unkillable at a significantly higher rate than in my ranked games. What exactly was causing this is hard to pin down, but a lack of penetration in damage dealer builds is the most obvious one. I also think a lack of anti-heal can play a big part as well. A lot of tanks rely on sustain to be so unkillable, and if you apply 80% anti-heal to them, they become a lot more manageable. Coordination is another big one that you're less likely to find in casuals. If you can coordinate against a tank, CC them and burn them down, they're going to be a lot less of a problem than if your team is split up or not responding well to a dive from a tank, not focusing the right targets, all that kind of stuff. There's a variety of factors, but going back to casuals really did open my eyes a little bit as to why there's so much noise around tank meta in the community. And this is valid, by the way. I'm not trying to make the argument that these players should just get good. It's ideal to cater to both high level and more casual players at the same time, though those ideals often do conflict, and I don't envy the devs for having to find that balance. To be honest though, I don't think full tanks are the main problem at all, even more so after the heavy protection nerfs from the last two patches, combined with the return of protection shred on items like Executioner and Totem of Death, which is a noticeable upgrade over just giving penetration, as well as Kinsight and Soul Reaver now being much more effective against full tanks. After all these changes, and arguably even before some of them, full tanks aren't really the problem in my opinion. The problem lies in bruisers that build 2 to 3 protection items and still feel significantly tanky, hitting critical breakpoints where backline damage dealers simply can't kill them in time before they get blown up. And much like balancing the game as a whole for more casual and competitive players, balancing tank items to be strong for tanks but not overpowered for bruisers is also a tough task. And admittedly, they've made some effort on this front with changes like Glad Shield and Pribwin, where they scale more heavily off of protections to disincentivize bruisers from building them while keeping them strong for full tanks. That's a step in the right direction in my opinion, but as I've said before, I think a more game-wide change to how protections work might be necessary to fix the bruiser problem. Either a change to the formula of how protections convert to damage mitigation that more heavily favors high protection counts, or some kind of system that grants additional mitigations at higher protections, something like that. This could of course have unintended consequences, but even a system as simple as saying, okay, at 100 item protections you straight up get an additional 5% mitigation, and at 200 protections you get another 10%, and at 300 item protections you get another 15%. This makes tanks that actually heavily invest in protections allowed to be tanky, while making it so bruisers gain less value from just slotting in 2 to 3 tank items in their builds. Again, this system isn't perfect and there might be a better way to approach it, but I'm just using it as an example of the kind of overarching system change that is probably necessary if they ever want tanks to be playable while not making bruisers completely broken. Another large thing that I think contributes to this problem, and honestly maybe one of the major contributors, is that base damage numbers are simply too high compared to scalings in Smite in general. This can often lead to tanks, but especially bruisers, just relying on their base numbers to do the work and not even needing to build much power to still deal deal solid damage. I mean, take a look at Herc and Odin, two of the most prominent bruiser junglers in recent memory. Hercules has 14-15 base damage and 250% strength scaling in one kit rotation. You'd need 566 strength for your scaling to even match your base numbers, never mind exceed them. Odin is similar with 1260 base damage and 190% strength plus 170% intelligence in a base kit rotation. His ult does damage as well, but it isn't guaranteed, so for his base kit, you need 663 strength or 741 intelligence for his scalings to match his base numbers. 663 strength is completely and utterly unachievable, and 741 intelligence is doable, but hard to reach in most builds without sacrificing other areas, especially after the OB7 stat squish. Even Thor, more traditionally an assassin than these other two, he has 1510 base damage and 350% strength in a kit rotation, and so would need 431 strength in his build for his scaling to match his base damage. 431 strength is somewhat doable, but definitely above what the average full damage build will give you. I feel like reducing the emphasis on base damage and putting more emphasis on scaling will do wonders for this issue. As I've just demonstrated, even with a full damage build, most gods actually get more damage from their base numbers than they do from their build. Shifting this balance more towards scaling would mean that they are sacrificing more damage if they choose not to build for damage. This also helps out with full tanks doing too much damage, which is another complaint I hear a lot. The vast majority of that comes from base damage and item procs, a lot of which have been recently changed to scale more and have less base damage, like Glad Shield for example. I'm just spitballing ideas here, and obviously such a sweeping change to base damage and scaling will bring up other issues in the game, like gods struggling to clear waves or jungle camps in the early game if you just nerf all of their base damages across the board. But I really feel like some kind of root solution is necessary here, and just changing some items won't fix the core problem. Power pots is another smaller thing that I think is an issue in terms of tanks not being tanky at all in very long games, as they just simply get outscaled as damage dealers gain way more value from the permanent strength and intelligence than any tank will. This only really becomes a big issue in games that stretch out into multiple power pots though, which is not most games, but I thought it was worth a mention here as it can really warp the perception when a tank dies almost instantly, and then you realize it's a 45-minute game where damage dealers have 3 power pots each and high amounts of percent pen. Another thing that contributes to this, I think, is the removal of flat penetration from the game. Flat pen helps keep bruisers in check to a certain extent, since flat pen applies after your percent pen and will be often removing a solid chunk of the remaining protections from a bruiser with only a couple of protection items in their build, whereas percent pen is going to be less effective in that regard. A lot of flat pen was also replaced with percent pen in the move to Smite 2, which can lead to builds having too much access to percent pen, which again makes tanks harder to balance with bruisers, since why would you go a full 6 item build of protection items if 49% of them are immediately useless against the enemy ADC building Executioner and Titan's Bane? You die so quick anyway that you might as well get some damage items and just nuke the backliner instead. Mitigations ignore penetration, which is why the potential solution I mentioned earlier would work in terms of allowing tanks to be truly tanky while not really buffing bruisers, since they wouldn't have the required protection counts in their build to reach the higher thresholds that provide the most mitigation. But what do you think on this topic? Are tanks an issue? Are bruisers an issue? And if so, what do you think the solution is to the problem? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.